Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers. With the release of Loom and Monkey Island in 1990, point-and-click adventures had begun enhancing their puzzle-solving gameplay with strong storytelling. These two releases marked the beginning of the point-and-click adventure golden age, since many other acclaimed point-and-click adventures released in the subsequent years. We can clearly see the impact of this golden age in this year's Game Awards. Out of the highest-rated games on IMDb from 1992 to 1993, which had 50 or more user ratings, 5 or 6 out of the top 10 were all point-and-click adventures. So, Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers, has some stiff competition. What is it that Gabriel Knight did that allowed it to garner more nominations than all of these other point-and-click adventures combined? Stay tuned to find out. Here with me tonight is my guest, Mitch. Mitch, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So, to give you guys a rundown on Gabriel Knight, for those who are unfamiliar, Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers is a point-and-click adventure game released in 1993 by Sierra Entertainment. While point-and-click adventures of the era were commonly lighthearted fantasy adventures, writer and designer Jane Jensen chose to instead create a dark, supernatural mystery thriller with horror elements set in modern-day New Orleans. You play as Gabriel Knight, a writer suffering from writer's block who seeks inspiration for his books by following his detective friend Franklin Mosley on his daily operations. When Detective Mosley begins to unravel a series of voodoo murders, Mosley and Gabriel will find themselves embroiled in a much larger conspiracy, which spans the whole city as well as other parts of the world. The game was designed and written by Jane Jensen, who would later go on to design other games as well as write 59 books. The voice cast included several famous actors and actresses. These include Mark Hamill, aka Luke from Star Wars, Tim Curry, aka the scientist from Rocky Horror Picture Show, Michael Dorn, aka Worf from Star Trek, Leah Remini, aka Carrie from the King of Queens sitcom show, and Jim Cummings, a voice actor in 483 different titles, including Winnie the Pooh from 1988 onwards. Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers has a total of 7 nominations. It is nominated for Best Female Character for Grandma Knight, Best Original Score, Best Art Direction, Best Narrative Composition, Best Male Character for Gabriel Knight, Best Female Character for Grace Nakamura, and Best Pixel 1993.
So it's interesting to see that we have 2 nominations for Best Female Character, and it's the only game of the season that has the potential to win all 3 theatrical categories. So this is very much a story-focused game. Story and characters at the very top here.
Yep, I mean, you never know. Maybe Gabriel happened to just barely fall short of the other categories, just number 6. But no, yeah, Mitch is right. It's a theatrical focused game, as are most point and clicks, But we'll get into that a bit more.
Yeah. Speaking of, I assume you probably want to start us off with Grandma Knight, a lovely old lady.
Yeah. So, what better way to introduce us than the kindly old lady that is Grandma Knight? So, the most defining characteristic of Grandma Knight is that she has incredibly wholesome grandmotherly traits. She loves Gabriel very much and voices that love often. Her love appears to be unconditional since, as Grace put it, there isn't anything Gabriel could do that would make her love him any less. She bakes molasses pies for Gabriel. She knits sweaters to raise funds for her church in her free time. She has a pleasant and soothing southern accent voice. And in general, the things that she discusses with Gabriel are relatively low-stakes, harmless matters, like how she tends her garden, and it functions as a nice, peaceful break from the other things that are going on in Gabriel's life, which are often calamitous and stressful. She also appreciates Gabriel's company, but appears healthy and content without Gabriel, such that you don't have to feel guilty about not visiting her often enough. Overall, for me, it makes me feel immense gratitude for the nice qualities of my grandparents and other family members, and she inspires me to be a good friend and family member for other people. Aside from her dominating grandmotherly traits, she also maintains her lovely demeanor despite the rest of her family tragically dying too early. Taking care of Gabriel gave her motivation to press on in life during those dark times, so perhaps she channels her sorrow into taking care of others. In addition, despite having a lot of flavor of being a traditional grandma, she's still willing to question authority figures despite being part of an older generation. And she acts as an excellent narrator for Gabriel's extended family. We see Grandma Knight's love for these characters as we hear about them from her, which inspires us to care more about this extended family as well. We also get to learn about it through the cozy atmosphere of a grandma recounting precious memories, which generally makes the experience very enjoyable. And that's it. Kind of hard to find fault with any of Gabriel Knight's perfect, wholesome grandmotherliness, so just pros, no cons.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I do remember this being a very strong pick for you, and it's nice to hear you talk about the lovely old grand lady.
Because that's what everyone in Gabriel Knight's here to get, dark supernatural mystery thriller, but they hit you with this, bam, super wholesome grandmother. So yeah, certainly wasn't what I came there for, but I was definitely here for it once it showed up. No questions there.
Well, she presents a really nice contrast to the other elements in the story, and we'll talk about it more later when we talk about Gabriel, because he's also nominated, but the two of them have a really nice connection, and in addition to just being a reprieve for him, it's also a space where he kind of lets down a lot of his usual persona and is just really real with his grandmother. So I like that about their connection a lot as well. So you're right. This does create a very welcome and warm atmosphere to the game that I think is remiss not to mention.
Mm-hmm. So next up for our categories, we have Best Original Score. The first point I have in favor of the score is that the soundtrack informs us of the personality of the characters involved. For example, Grandma Knight has her own theme song which plays as you're in the house with her. In my opinion, the song conveys a number of the key personality traits of Grandma Knight: safety, gratitude, lasting true love, and peace. The soundtrack also gives you an idea of what the characters are feeling during the scenes. For example, there's a song that plays during New Orleans Day 10. This takes place during Gabriel's darkest moment. He just faced a major setback. The stakes have been raised even higher. He doesn't have anyone that can help him, and he doesn't even have much of an idea of what to do to solve things. The droning electronics and the grunge guitar sell the dark, low-hope atmosphere, but the upbeat percussion keeps the player motivated and moving forward despite their setbacks. The choral chants add a sad and mystical air to the mix. In general, the song helps to guide the player on how to feel in the situation. With a different song, the player could have easily felt hopeless or aimless, but the song, crafted as it is, allows the player to feel sad and dejected, yet motivated to move forward despite those things. The next point I have in favor of the soundtrack is that, for me at least, the soundtrack did not get old. The soundtrack includes different moods, instrumentation, and melodies between the different songs. There's church music, African music, creepy music, jazz and blues music, detective music, medieval castle music, and so on. In addition, the music has multiple layers to it, which means that you can pay attention to different parts as you listen multiple times, which also helps the songs to not get old as you're hearing them on repeat. Overall, I would say that the soundtrack, for me, was consistently good, evocative, and game-enhancing throughout the runtime. I didn't like maybe 10% of the songs, but I liked 52% of the songs, and I really liked 38% of the songs. No songs quite reached the love it threshold, though.
I think I would agree with you on this soundtrack not quite reaching that love it threshold, but I think I'm a little more divided on the soundtrack as a whole. I remember when you initially put it forward, I was quite skeptical. It seemed more generic backgroundy music to me, but upon listening to it more and experiencing it with the game, for reference, I actually just watched a playthrough, and so I just kind of kicked back, relaxed, and watched somebody play through the game, and I actually found that to be a really nice experience. This game is incredibly cozy. I think part of that is the art, and a part of that is, honestly, a big part of that is the music. And there's a real kind of absence of time sensation that came through really strongly with this game. And so it really is like going to bring the mood down into a slower paced, a relaxed sensation, more so than I think I was anticipating. And the kind of darker tracks were definitely the ones that appealed to me the most. I really liked the Return to New Orleans. That is a really strong pick. And Wheel Within Wheel, that's a really good one. All the highlights, I think, for me are really big highlights. And I think they elevate the game's score quite a bit. The only real con I have at the end of the day is that for a lot of the music, it is sort of like trapped within the format of the game itself, and that it is just your standard point and click adventure fare. So the music is there doing its best, but there's not really a whole lot of like, I guess, there's not a whole lot it can take it from beyond what you're seeing, unless it's going to be totally introspective, which I think is how you kind of came away with it, where it creates a really strong sensation just to think about. And as a mood piece, it really absorbs you into the premise of the game as a whole. That being this New Orleans voodoo cult that you're investigating.
Well, thank you for your thoughts on soundtrack, Mitch. I'd say that you summed up your thoughts relatively well. And as far as whether the soundtrack is, good overall or only good in parts, we can leave that up to the voters to decide. Give it a listen and, see how you feel, particularly in context with the game if you can.
Well, yeah, and actually to kind of segue us a little bit, part of that context is the way in which it combines with the art. So why don't you tell me a little bit about the art direction nomination?
Well, thank you for that very effective segue, Mitch. So the first thing I'd like to mention in favor of art direction is that the game has effective and artistic character portraits when talking to important characters. The character portraits are high resolution when much of the rest of the game is low resolution. And the character portraits are filled with high contrast, moody lighting, which gets the player into an evocative frame of mind as the characters talk. While the character portraits tend to be high resolution, the rest of the game tends to be in more of a low resolution art. One advantage this has is that the game has many numerous smooth animations going on. Characters will be performing music, tap dancing, or making hand animations as they talk. This adds to their characterization and makes them feel more lifelike. The background art is vibrant and makes you feel like you're there in the city. And the game also comes with a backstory comic book containing beautiful art inspired by the Sandman comics. In this comic book, characters are very expressive, lighting is very moody, and panels grow to emphasize certain scenes. The comic book is very important to the story of Gabriel Knight, so it is good that so much care went into making it as detailed as it was. The next point I have in favor of art direction is that the beginning of the game starts with a cutscene showing Gabriel's nightmare. The nightmare is full of disturbing and hallucinogenic visions. The enigmatic nightmare cutscene replays at the end of the day on most of the days in the game. As the player gets further in the game, the dream will make progressively more and more sense as Gabriel gets close to the heart of the mystery. And lastly, when important events occur, the game illustrates them with well-done comic book style cutscenes, which is also a nice touch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like those extra effort they put in to make it more cinematic, to create a thread that links the whole game together. It creates a really strong atmosphere for sure.
So while that is a good summary of the advantages we had with the art direction, we do have a few issues with it. So for one thing, the low resolution in the scenes can sometimes make it hard to make out what are the various elements in the scene. This is mitigated by a text description at the bottom of the screen, combined with the narrator having comments when you examine certain objects. But this solution still requires you to mouse over things, which is inferior to if the object was immediately apparent on what it was. The game also tries to mitigate this by having interactable objects stand out from the rest of the background, which makes it less bad, but it's still a con in my opinion.
Yeah.
And next, unfortunately, the art direction also leans into some negative stereotypes regarding African American people and voodoo. It goes from them being well-dressed and educated to being dressed in primal tribal wear, which is associated with negative associations from African tribes. And the art emphasizes the sexual and violent aspects of the voodoo rituals, which feels like sensationalism for the sake of exoticism and relies on some negative stereotypes of African Americans.
One thing I just want viewers to maybe keep in mind is, so we're going to a bygone era. It's 1993. And so some of that is going to have to be taken into context. And I think part of the challenge with us internally about Gabriel Knight is, on the one hand, it's really interesting that the game is tackling a real world place and inventing characters and basing them off of, at least on some level, real world circumstances. And so it's unfortunate that a few of the ways it handles it isn't as elegant or as nuanced or as sensitive as it ought to be by our modern lenses. But nevertheless, it's still a game worth your attention, is the eventual conclusion we landed on, because it's interesting to see how it tackles something that most other games would not bother with. I mean, we have like Sam & Max here, which is up for one award, and that's another point-and-click game. But at the end of the day, it's just kind of a cartoon, and it doesn't really speak to the human condition. It doesn't talk about real-world events or anything of like, I don't want to be too dismissive of it, but you could get the idea very easily how a game like that is more for the entertainment side of things. So I think we kind of felt that despite some of the conflicting opinions we have about some of the choices made in Gabriel Knight, there was one very important and worthwhile choice that they did make, which was to try to capture a real place and a real people group. And so for that, it's noteworthy, but yeah, do take some of that into consideration as we go on through the game.
That's fair. I will say that as a minor tangent, I would add on to that. It's interesting that you would choose Sam & Max for an example, because I would actually argue that Sam & Max also has a larger than average amount of emphasis on real world, because it acts as a satire of American culture. In fact, it's kind of interesting because a YouTuber I watched the other day, JJ MacCullough, he's like a Canadian who analyzes like American culture, and he actually listed Sam & Max as a premier example of media that like emphasizes and satirizes like American culture and stuff, for him at least. So there is some degree of real world overlap with that one, but it's also to some extent designed to be a fun adventure first and foremost. And you could also make even if Sam & Max may not be the best analogy, you could also say similar things about a lot of the other ones we have this year. Rondo of Blood, it's not really meant to. There's a little bit of commentary in there, but it's mostly about, having a fun time slaughtering vampires and getting your cool anime power-ups with your Grand Cross taking over the whole screen, all that stuff. So, yeah. I can see where you're coming from and such.
With video games, sometimes I feel as though I'm extracting more than what's intended by the designers, and Sam & Max is commenting on these things. Like, I believe you, and I'm sure that is intentional, but it almost feels like a rogue element in a lot of games of this time period, and even today to some extent. There's an effort to, like the classic example I can think of is, it like makes fun of RPGs while being a great RPG. I feel like I've seen 10,000 different games that all do that at this point, and so it's just like old news now. But with something like Gabriel Knight, this one is making a real intentional effort to extrapolate the real world that we live in and try to depict it and tell a story within that. And it's like faithful, if not inaccurate, and showing their limitations on a number of occasions. And this is one of those instances where it is a limitation. But nevertheless, like, I guess the point I'm trying to highlight is that as opposed to Sam & Max, yes, it is like a commentary. Sure, it could be that. And I'm sure that many people extract it in that way. But there is a difference when you depict something as it is in our surroundings. I think it appeals to people on a much different level. It certainly made a much stronger appeal to me, because I don't always want to have to, make the jump in connection of what this game is actually about. Sometimes it's nice when something just makes it very clear that it is about something that does matter and that I should be more knowledgeable on. So do you kind of get where I'm saying with that?
Yeah, I got you. Where like games like Sam and Max, even if they did have some degree of commentary on real life issues, because it's wrapped in a veneer of cute cartoony characters, it's not as immediately apparent to you, and so you're not as comfortable with making like reads in that direction because it might be just something that's in your head. Whereas like with Gabriel Knight, it's like when they have such an onslaught of like real life historical stuff that's going on, like, okay, yeah, they're definitely trying to go an extra mile to like portray real life issues going on and stuff. And so that's part of why you're able to get more meaning out of it. But it's also why, to some extent, we have to hold a bigger magnifying lens to it because when they do say something that's a bit offensive, real world people are having their feelings hurt and stuff like that. So, something that we gotta be extra conscientious about, while we admire the effort, it just came short, unfortunately, in certain areas.
Well, and that's another interesting way to put it too, because comfortability levels in terms of, for myself, of figuring out what the meaning of it is one thing. But I think I also just commend the effort to make a conscious choice to make the game about real life and to set it in that. Because, this is a brand new project, a brand new idea. They gave Jane Jensen the reins to make whatever she wanted, as I understand it. Whereas like with Sam and Max, they have to adapt something that already exists. But here, she has free reign to make whatever she wants. And, we saw last season Loom and The Secret of Monkey Island, which were original properties as well, as far as I know. But I just think that there is something noteworthy about trying to tackle the real world and represent that in a game form at this point in time. Because even still, like that is an issue that I do think in our modern day lens we struggle with a lot. Like if you look at, the Game of the Year winners across other award shows, the games that win are like fantasy games, sci-fi games, and that's fine, but you compare that with like the Oscars and there's been like 0 so far. Some people argue Everything Everywhere All at Once, but that's more like surrealistic and meta. It's hardly, or like vaguely futuristic, or it's like parallel worlds or whatever. I'm like, that's not really sci-fi. That's like a science fiction concept, but the movie itself is not science fiction. It's not, this isn't Star Trek or anything like that. So yeah, it's just a difference in the kind of genres and things that show up within the different mediums. Just to kind of make it clear, yes, it's easier for me to grasp what they're doing, but I also just appreciate the effort so much more than I do for a game that, scooches away from it, because it's hard. Talking about the real world is much tougher, especially with a video game, because now you have player agency and they have control over certain elements, and that can lead into other moral conundrums. So there's a lot more logistics that go into it when you're working with games, I think, and it's a much rarer feat, and so when it does come up, it becomes a worthwhile conversation.
Yeah, makes sense.
But why don't you take us into the narrative composition now, because this will help kind of elaborate on the strengths and the weaknesses of the game at large, I think.
Yeah. So the first point I have in favor of best narrative composition is that the characters have depth and maturity and feel pretty realistic with a few exceptions. The game atmosphere also starts cozy, funny, and relaxing, but as the game goes on, the stakes are continually raised, and there is a steady rollout of revelatory information. That makes it so that it's engaging throughout the whole game, but kind of in a different way at first, and then later on, it ends up being more tense, whereas early it's relaxing, which is nice. In addition to the stakes being raised as time goes on, the game also does a great job of building up dread from all of the ominous signs from day 3 onwards. To provide some examples, the beginning of each day begins with Gabriel's bookstore, which acts as a safe space for the player. The day is displayed, some of Gabriel's poetry is read, and mellow music plays while Gabriel and Grace prepare for the investigations for the day. However, at a certain point in the game, this safe space is violated with something very creepy. The creepiness works much better at unsettling the player due to the prior expectations that they have been set up with. Other things that change as the atmosphere gets more dark and threatening with time include the horoscope readings that Gabriel gets in the newspaper become more disturbing. A guy stares at you from the window, refusing to interact or leave, regardless of your actions. And a background element in the city that you thought was harmless is shown to actually be quite harmful and creepy. That being said, though, the game has more than just spooks at its disposal. The writing is also funny, and specifically funny in a way that conveys people's character. To provide an example, Gabriel, after pestering Grace into answering some questions, asked, "How come we haven't gone out yet?" And Grace responds, "I'm still waiting around for that lobotomy. As soon as I get it, I'll let you know." It shows that Gabriel is abrasive with his romantic advances, and Grace is witty and clever by roasting him in a funny manner. And lastly, in favor of narrative, I would say that the game ends up being more than just empty entertainment because it gives the player deeper things to chew on. The high-stakes narrative is paired with Gabriel's journey of self-discovery and redemption, and the ending strives to highlight how Gabriel manages to balance mercy and responsibility when they come into conflict, and how this contrasts with his ancestor.
Yeah, I think the writing is actually pretty strong in this one. It's pretty well composed, and there's a pretty good thread of interest that keeps you engaged the whole time. That said, though, unfortunately, Gabriel Knight does try to make a story that has minority representation, which is good, and they try to not portray minorities in a negative light, but are not always successful in that. And we're actually going to quote a game reviewer from Fake Geek Boy, his review, because I think just really sums up our sentiments as well when we were doing our research. And he says, and I quote, "The actual writing of the game is very good, particularly when it comes to pitching a more serious plot than is typical for high-profile point-and-click adventures, but I don't know that I'm quite comfortable with the story's handling of race and voodoo. To her credit, Jensen seems to have done an impressive amount of research on the subject and also drops fairly heavy hints that the dark rites adhered to by the villains constitutes an unusual practice which doesn't necessarily originate in African voodoo, and would be regarded with fear and loathing by most voodoo and voodoo practitioners. Not all the black people you meet are into voodoo, not all the people involved in the conspiracy you encounter are black. However, the game puts forth a conspiracy theory that the fictive secret society it proposes is behind the Haitian slave revolt and the coming of voodoo to New Orleans, and has been the major power on the New Orleans occult underground for centuries. All of its leaders are black. The white voodoo practitioners you speak to the most is, as it is strongly suggested, a flaky new age sort that Dr. John directs you to mainly for the purposes of misdirection. Most black people you meet are in fact either leaders of the sect or acting on its behalf, to the point where as a player I felt prompted to feel suspicious of every black person I encountered. Maybe that's just a problem with you, author? Well, yes, maybe it is. But if that's the case, it's a problem that this particular scenario didn't do much to discourage." End quote. Yeah, I'm afraid that is very much a similar sentiment that's shared among most of our Oscarina members. It's sort of great that they are tackling this, and there is a lot of effort put into separating, the difference between this particular branch of voodoo versus voodoo on the whole. But it's like, you just don't have enough representation in the game to make it feel like you've done a good job of separating the fact from the fiction and not leading people into suspecting things that they should not.
Yeah, I agree with the quote, and I would say that, that more or less sums up our issues with the handling of race and voodoo to a certain extent. So, yeah, bit unfortunate. In fact, one of our voters, Randy, she was actually really enjoying the game, but she ended up being let down by the narrative going down this racially problematic direction despite doing its homework. So it sucks because, she was coming into it with positive, expectations and really enjoying it. And so it's not like she came in prepared to hate it, and it's not like she even hated it at the end of the day, but it did end up making the game a lot less enjoyable for her, unfortunately.
The research does feel enough to where when you go through the game yourself, you're going to be pretty impressed. If you know nothing about voodoo, you're going to come away with at least a few tidbits that are going to surprise you, things that you weren't maybe aware of. There is a lot of research that does bleed through in the text as well. It's just kind of the main plot sort of drops the ball on that, unfortunately, which, a bit of a blight on the game, but there it is. What can you do?
So I think that about sums up our thoughts on the narrative.
Yeah, let's move on to best male character and talk about Gabriel.
So I do have some pros in favor of Gabriel, but for starters, I have a really large, thing that I call my mixed bag category for things that are both an advantage and a disadvantage for the character.
Let's stay in this low point a bit longer, I guess.
Yeah, sorry. It's just, it worked better for the structure of my point on this. So, sorry to be a bit of a Debbie Downer.
No, it's all right. Go for it.
So, for the mixed bag element of Gabriel, he is rather sleazy, particularly with how he hits on women. The game does try to portray his actions as harmful and immoral, though the narrative does not condemn his actions quite strongly enough for our tastes. Bad behavior is recognized as such by the other characters, as well as Gabriel himself, making it clear that the media is not intending for this behavior to be thought of as moral and good. As a result, this is nice because we can follow the point of view of an immoral character without feeling grimy because it's clear we're doing what Gabriel would do, not what is actually the right thing or what we would try to do. Gabriel also admits his faults without really trying to justify them, which is nice because it allows you to dwell on the implications of being moral instead of getting caught up on deciding if he's moral or not. Also, oftentimes, the game plays up the naughtiness of Gabriel's motives while stopping the consequences of Gabriel's actions from being excessively harmful. This is good because it allows you to appreciate and understand his immoral traits, while mitigating the amount of disgust and cringe that you might feel if those actions unfolded to their completion. For example, he makes sexual comments to his employee Grace while she works for him, which sucks and is harmful. But Grace cuts him off, usually before it gets more obnoxious. Grace doesn't really need the job that badly, so Gabriel is not in as much of a position of power over her compared to somebody who needed the job more. And, at least outwardly, Grace does not seem to show that this sexual harassment is psychologically impacting her to a large extent. As a result, it increases the likelihood that this isn't actually causing large amounts of psychological harm to her, though, disclaimer, this is a work of fiction. In real life, psychological harm is not something that is always outwardly apparent, so you shouldn't assume that people are not bothered by sexual harassment or other things just because they don't show outward symptoms of traumatic harm as a result of it. Nevertheless, since this is a work of fiction, since that's the outwardly conveyed, emotions and
that's all we have to go
behavior,
on.
that's at least the impression that I got as a reader.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, as another example where they play up the naughtiness while preventing it from being too excessively harmful, Gabriel steals a priest's outfit and shows no remorse, but instead joyfully exclaims, "I can't resist black," which emphasizes how much he's being a brat, but at the end of the day, the only harm that's done is that a priest's robe is stolen, which would probably have been replaced without too much financial hardship. So, while there are advantages to preventing Gabriel from carrying out his most problematic actions, this also means that the narrative doesn't really show the full consequences of his actions, and that can make the actions seem less harmful than they actually are. For example, the police station has a photographer woman. Gabriel asks if Mosley can take a photo of him alongside the police photographer, presumably so that he can get close to her while the photo is being taken. Mosley jokingly says that Gabriel is going to get Mosley fired for sexual harassment, and as a result, Gabriel does not do the action. On one hand, stopping this is early before it happens is nice, since the player doesn't have to deal with the unpleasant feelings of seeing that unfolds and making the police photographer uncomfortable more than she already is. On the other hand, however, this also means that the viewer may not understand how harmful Gabriel's actions would be if they were carried out. In addition, the audience doesn't get to see the negative social and legal consequences that Gabriel would suffer if he was to carry out these actions. Also, despite Gabriel's problematic actions towards women, Malia, the fortune teller, and possibly Grace still have romantic interest in Gabriel, which does lessen the impact of his actions a bit more than we would like, which ties into what we said about maybe not condemning his actions as strongly as we would like. But that about sums up what we had as far as, mixed bag, which is kind of, cons, but also a little bit of pros there as well. You have anything else you want to add on that, Mitch?
I do. There's a lot to kind of unpack there, especially when we're getting into the minutia. Why don't you take me through the pros, though, for the time being, and then I will try to jump in and consolidate the two afterwards.
Yeah, sounds good. So, while we do have some issue with, Gabriel not suffering as many consequences or being condemned as much as we would like, he does still have a number of pros that makes him a very compelling character. So, he's actually pretty good as an amateur detective. He is clever, crafty, conniving, observant, and deductive. He's particularly good at using his charisma, acting, stealing, and lying skills to his advantage. Gabriel's moral shortcomings also enable his character to explore elements that wouldn't be possible with a purely moral good protagonist. As previously mentioned, it's part of the reason he is able to be an effective detective. And Gabriel's moral problems pave the way to Gabriel having a redemption arc of sorts, which works better on account of having behaviors that are actually immoral, which he should feel bad about. His immoral tendencies may also be what allow him to avoid repeating the sins of the fathers, which is kind of key to the message of the whole game. However, explaining that in more detail would be more lengthy than our video allows, so you'll just have to experience that for yourself. I also like that Gabriel is not content to just be a hedonist. He is also searching for identity, meaning, and the supernatural. As an example, during one exchange with a bartender, the bartender said, "It sounds like the same thing over and over. I just want to say, enough already." And Gabriel replies, "Sounds like my life." Seeing these two elements coincide and interact, the hedonistic elements while searching for greater things element, is cool and a trope that I rather like personally. Gabriel's also very kind to his grandma. He has a unique dialogue option with her where he can give her adorable compliments. And Gabriel is also caring and serious when people are actually in danger, particularly people he cares about. He protects and emotionally encourages Grace when she is in danger. He hounds police when the professor dies and they aren't investigating him. And he tries to save Malia, even when she may be guilty or complicit in some bad actions. And that sort of wraps up at least the core advantages to Gabriel as a character, I would say.
Mm-hmm. A lot of this, like, especially in the mixed bag territory, it sounds kind of, it sounds worse than potentially it is. I mean, this is going to be one of those sense things, because his dialogue can say some pretty outlandish things that even the sleaziest among us, I think, would be too ashamed or reluctant to say. But at the same time, he is voiced by Tim Curry, who takes full ownership of this character once he begins to embody him. I mean, he's like the likable bad boy. You know, he's got a bike. He's a writer who's kind of poses as a detective and, you know, a bit of a ladies' man. So he's got this archetype surrounding him that is appealing to a lot of people, despite how some of the elements or facets of that archetype are not the best way you should conduct yourself. We actually had a similar conversation, Tyler and I did, back in the Snatcher review from 92, because the main character in that was also problematic in a number of ways. And I guess if like, maybe you could elaborate, what do you think separates Gabriel from Gillian from Snatcher?
Yeah, so I in general had, I honestly did a lot of soul searching in regards to this, because I was having a weird time where it's like, you know, that's weird. I really enjoy Gabriel as a character, and I really am put off by Gillian as a character, even though they should theoretically be the same as far as being the likable bad boy, what gives. And yeah, I would say that for me, it's like, in Snatcher, they didn't really do that much work to actually, like, you know, condemn Gillian's actions, considering that, like, you could go through most of these really iffy dialogue options. If you had consequences at all, they would be very minor in the grand scheme of things, you know? Whereas, like, with Gabriel's thing, it's like, if he hits on, you know, Grace or things like that, he'll usually get told off. And, like, you know, and Gabriel himself admits, yeah, I'm actually, you know, not a particularly good person and stuff like that. So it's like the narrative framing of, like, Gillian is just supposed to be like, you know, aw shucks, you know, that's just Gillian, you know, little, you know, likable guy and stuff like that, you know. Whereas, like, with Gabriel, it's more like, no, he's actually not a great person, but, you know, he still has his good qualities and stuff like that. Just, you know, don't try and emulate him is sort of what the game is telling, you know. And so, like, I think that for me, that definitely, you know, made it a lot more palatable, you know, for me, in the sense that, like, it was very clear that while he had these negative actions, the game was not condoning his behavior. That being said, you know, even though it wasn't condoning it, like I said earlier, you know, it doesn't quite condemn it strongly enough for my taste personally. You know, I mean, it's sort of an interesting thing because, like, Jane Jensen says that, you know, she was inspired in some ways by the, like, bad boy archetypes from, like, romances. And, like, those can also be fairly, you know, problematic and iffy and stuff like that. But, like, the thing is that, at least, I'm not super well versed on the trope, but like my understanding is that like the way they get away with it in most romance books is that they give the bad boy the veneer of being the bad boy, and they, act like he's so bad when really he's not. Whereas like with Gabriel, for better and worse, he actually is, in some cases not particularly great as a person and stuff like that, which allows him to do some cool things. But, it also means that you have to tread this delicate line of like, how much do we want to have him do bad stuff and be condemned for it? Or how much do we want to just like stop it short of like doing something that would make the viewer really uncomfortable and stuff like that. So yeah, kind of a interesting balancing act. And that's part of why I had such an elaborate thing to say about the mixed bag and whatnot, is that, that did really strike me the most as being the biggest pro and con to his character, because it really got me to examine this immoral aspect of a character in a different way, even if it may be a little bit problematic while it was doing so.
I think that's a good summation, especially because we definitely like characters that are more complex or nuanced. And so if they have flaws, we kind of welcome that. I mean, I think we should welcome that, because that's more of getting into like character study work and human psychology. And if I could chime in with my own sense for Gillian versus Gabriel, because Gillian, of course, is not nominated, I would agree with that sentiment. He doesn't have the sort of moral compass either through the script of the game at large or as a character to kind of funnel him down a particular path that is one that's, I guess, on some level agreeable, or at least so that the story can function. Whereas Gabriel has that in the form of Grace, which is, of course, our other female character nomination here. She's his very knowledgeable and very well-learned bookkeeper. She uses that knowledge to help Gabriel and you as the player at several times during the game. She usually tries to use her knowledge to teach Gabriel more so than to use it as an excuse to condescend. She can definitely be a little aggressive in her approach, but it's more like she's just using the kind of intense language that he's using already. And so the two of them, they come across as buds to me. There's definitely like a hint that he's going too far. And I think in a real world context, this would be just enormously frustrating. But it does have sitcom vibes, especially because I've seen King of Queens. I've seen Leah Remini perform in that. And Grace, she just totally embodies Grace's character in this game. I mean, it's almost like she stepped right out of King of Queens. So I think she has the kind of spirit to get in and tussle in a word play, and has no problems with having to stand up for herself in that regard.
It's kind of funny. It almost makes you wonder if like the writers of King of Queens were Gabriel Knight fans, and they're just like, you know what our sitcom needs? We need Grace. Hey, why don't we just hire Grace and just put her in here? And yeah, the show's a lot better for it, for sure, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it probably could just be her, like her personality type, which she kind of leans into a lot. She just has a very outspoken demeanor and a real good, strong sense of like self, and She has a really good commanding presence. Like if you watch the show, she does a great job of holding her own in that one. But yeah, and sticking with the game, she's also passionate about religion, mythology, and the supernatural, which is cool because it gives her and Gabriel something to kind of bond over. She also sasses Gabriel in a kind of deadpan and seemingly disinterested fashion, which contrasts with her being passionate about her topics of interest. And so there's a clear line between the two, and I really like that about her, how she is able to turn on when it's time to almost act like a surrogate parent on some level, and then when it's time to flex out of that and just be relaxed once again. She also has great funny banter with Gabriel. It's your flashlight, she says. Something you can actually turn on. This is a good one. Cares about Gabriel, and she tries to help him out despite her insults and annoyance with him. And that's kind of showing her genuine spirit come through. So she stays in dangerous situations so that she can research more things for Gabriel. She unwraps his package to try to understand the danger he is in at one point, which is of course a breach, but it also just goes to show that the two of them just trust each other enough. And Gabriel doesn't really get mad. He's just like, you open my package. And she's like, well, someone has to look after you. And so you can kind of see the true camaraderie the two of them have. And she tries to advise him to avoid certain dangers as well. And honestly, she kind of reminds me of like Midge from Hitchcock's Vertigo a little bit, if you've ever seen that film. Great film, classic piece. it's a critical but ultimately compassionate foil for the main character, and that's what made me think of it, is that Midge acts as this moral compass for the main character and provides really valuable insight that the main character fails to heed. As far as how well Gabriel heeds it, I think I'll leave that for you guys to decide for yourself if you decide to play it.
Yeah, I'd say that sums up my thoughts on the advantages of Grace's character very well, and in general, I agree with all of them. That being said, there is one con in favor of Grace for a female character. We briefly alluded to this earlier, but she appears to be possibly jealous of Gabriel's romantic interests, despite the fact that she, in my opinion at least, is too good for him. And this mildly undermines her condemnation of his behavior, but not entirely, as love works in mysterious ways. That being said, though, even if she may have some feelings in a romantic direction towards Gabriel, she doesn't pursue those feelings and start dating him, even if that attraction may be there. And as a result, Grace will not voice feelings related to her jealousy unless she can also back it up with other valid reasonings. So overall, I get the feeling that Grace realizes that while she may be partially attracted to Gabriel, he has many problems that would make that romance not worth pursuing at this time. And that allows her earlier condemnations to still be valid in context of the narrative, even if her jealousy diminishes the validity a little bit.
At this point, I kind of don't think I agree with quite as much. I think it's a bit of a stretch to suggest that she's interested in him. There's like a couple points that maybe point in that direction. I think it definitely detracts from some of the banter and the dynamic of the two, because I think if you view the lens that they're just friends, these things fall into place much easier. But this could potentially just be my way of sort of rose-tinted glasses through it. So maybe that's something that I should kind of re-examine as I go through the game again. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's up to you. I mean, that's just however you like to read the game. At the end of the day, it's just about, where you find meaning and enjoyment from it. So I'm not going to be the meaning police and be like, no, you have to read the character this way or anything like that. You can death the author as much as you like and, read the character however you want to, if that's how you like to enjoy the game and such.
Yeah, and it is worth mentioning simply because Gabriel is a ladies' man, and they make that point abundantly clear throughout the game. So it's entirely possible that they wanted the impression to be, all the girls are into this guy, so that way you get to play the cool detective-y character. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to psychoanalyze the authors much more than that.
Yeah, I don't know if I would go so far as to say that, they wanted to seem like all the girls are into him because, there are some instances where, he swings and strikes out and so forth. But at least there is a significant number who end up being attracted to him and stuff. I mean, as he puts it, he has this tragic poet samurai appeal and whatnot. So that may work for some people, even if the other questionable elements and such. But yeah, I don't know. I suppose it is subjective to a certain extent as far as, how much, you, the viewer, feel that Gabriel is or is not meant to be attractive to a lot of women and such.
Tragic poet samurai is such a great line. So both you can see where the instincts to vote in Gabriel and narrative comp come in when you got lines like that. It's just freaking great.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. Well, let's kind of pull ourselves into talking about this game's Best Pixel nomination. I'll let you kind of carry it away then.
Yeah, sure. In terms of the other categories, in my opinion, Gabriel Knight is very good at direction, good at exploration, fellowship, and relaxation, and best music track for the main theme. I would consider Gabriel Knight to be just fine at interface, technical artistry, and level design. And I would say that the game is subpar at challenge and achievement, and unfortunately bad at sound atmosphere. To explain a bit more why it is very good at direction, Gabriel Knight is commendable in many ways for having a vision for the game that is dark, supernatural, and integrated into real life. It also integrated the storytelling into the point-and-click gameplay and recruited a very good voice acting cast. However, the improvements in vision and the implementation of that vision were not quite as ambitious as some of the other games that were nominated. And the execution of that vision was unfortunately marred by the racially problematic elements that we mentioned during the narrative segments. So, at the end of the day, it barely didn't make the cut for our 5 games nominated for Best Direction. To elaborate on why the game is bad at sound atmosphere, the music is much louder than the dialogue, and there's no way to fix it in the menu. Also, the death segments and the dream sequences were often rather lacking in sound effects, which lowered the impact of the scenes and kind of took me out of the experience a bit personally. And lastly, to elaborate why the game is subpar on challenge and achievement, I am not typically a fan of point-and-click adventure challenge, and Gabriel Knight does not do a lot to change that, unfortunately. I wasn't a fan of about 1/3 of the steps involved in the puzzle solutions. These puzzle steps were often very hard and at times were unintuitive for me. Sierra did allow users to purchase a hint book and talk on a hint helpline for 95 cents a minute, so these difficult puzzles were not game-breaking for players, but in my opinion, they should have included the hint book with the game and done more to encourage players to use it. In the current state, when the difficult puzzles do come up, they unfortunately bring the pacing of the game to a halt, which hurts the overall experience significantly. That being said, though, Jane Jensen has mentioned in interviews that it was a deliberate, intentional choice to make Gabriel Knight a difficult point-and-click adventure experience. So it could be that this is maybe something that would be more palatable for point-and-click adventure veterans who are just really good at this sort of thing. Me not being a veteran, it tended to be more of a problem than an advantage. So, just take that into consideration that I'm not a point-and-click adventure veteran. So maybe my, experience may not be the same as you if you happen to be more experienced with it.
Yeah, and if you want a reference for a game that does point-and-click gameplay challenge and achievement well, last season, The Secret of Monkey Island was nominated, and Corbett was on that call. So I would direct you that way for further detail.
Excellent reference point. So, to summarize my best pixel pitch, similar to other point-and-click adventure titles, Gabriel Knight is good at storytelling, less good at providing a satisfying challenge, and then a mix of quality at other categories. However, what sets Gabriel Knight apart from other point-and-click adventure games was just how good that the narrative ended up being, as well as how the other game elements came together to support those storytelling elements. The game was written by Jane Jensen, who later went on to write 59 books. And in my opinion, the author-level writing is exemplified in the game via the witty dialogue, the realistic, fleshed-out characters, and the story that manages to balance high stakes with personal significance. And the conveyance of this story was then bolstered by an excellent soundtrack, art style, and voice actor cast, which were made possible by the money, resources, and other talented individuals at Sierra Entertainment. That being said, I believe that Mitch had a different angle as far as why Gabriel Knight may be deserving of Best Pixel.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I don't disagree with anything that you said there. I do have more extended thoughts, and I might repeat myself slightly because of some of the things I'm going to be repeating from earlier. But my whole take, I think, I really just want to hammer home the choice that was made and why that's significant and how well it does or does not work. So, for me, Gabriel Knight makes the bold choice of setting its story in the real world. One of the more challenging criteria video games face as an art form is their often reluctant attitude to address humanity in a real comparative context. We can extrapolate themes and messages from games like Super Mario World or Tetris, but it's likely to be a stretch in terms of making an impactful comment on culture, history, or the human condition. And this is, specifically what Best Pixel is concerned with. It is a very different matter to use the medium to replicate scenarios that could feasibly exist in real life because, when done well, the meaning becomes more tangibly purposeful. And sure, Gabriel Knight is not entirely realistic given the inclusion of supernatural voodoo, and yet this merely provides an expression of the many layers and interpretations of actual voodoo practices and serves as a conversation starter. Its contemporaries either failed to reach such depth or do so in a highly abstract way, creating a barrier to entry for many people. When examining masterworks in other art forms, the choice of subject matter often plays an equal role in the craftsmanship of that medium. Paintings like The Last Supper or American Gothic, books such as Homer's Odyssey and The Grapes of Wrath, films such as Casablanca and Life is Beautiful are all aesthetically significant. However, their thematics add to the larger conversation concerning the history of humanity by framing a culture in time. This provides people with a method through which to learn more about the human condition, and is something that video games struggle with on the whole. So yes, Gabriel Knight does make an important choice, distinguishing itself from other games of the time and arguably even today. Without games like Gabriel Knight, gaming becomes an echo chamber of programming expertise and hyperfixation on design trends, which are hardly universal interests. It is certainly a more meaningful and more socially applicable narrative than something like Doom or Mega Man X. However, and this is a big however, such a choice is laudable only within the context of computer gaming culture. Like any art form, gaming is unique, and so the refusal to harness game-related aesthetics, as Gabriel Knight has shown, counts against it in the long run. Its lack of any gameplay or level design nomination sheds some light as to this weakness. There is nothing noteworthy about its interface, technical, or sound design either. Even a Best Direction nomination, a way to elaborate on its aesthetic importance, is noticeably absent. At the end of the day, this is your standard point-and-click adventure flair, and this may be why the larger gaming community has not considered it tremendously relevant. It is a story about real humanity, which is good, but it is simultaneously the antithesis of innovation. In other words, it's not Picasso, Lord of the Rings, or Citizen Kane, because its use of the medium is stagnant and unremarkable. Even Snatcher and Myst are similar point-and-click games that harness the format in more dynamically interesting ways. Gabriel Knight does raise an all too relevant talking point, to be sure, but it remains unclear if that alone is enough to take a Best Pixel win, especially when its sensitivity toward the culture and history of voodoo is so problematic. However well-intentioned it attempted to be. If it did win, it would be in spite of the play experience that video games and only video games can create, and as such, it would be a win for one important merit while at the same time a loss in another. So I kind of see the game as sort of teetering that seesaw. It sort of does one aspect of gaming that I think is really important and that is just so underrepresented. But at the same time, its execution of that isn't great, and it also lacks a lot of that kind of gameplay goodness that can really demonstrate why this medium was so essential.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I wouldn't personally go so far as to say that Gabriel Knight is the antithesis of innovation in the gameplay, because there are still certain things that it does pretty neat that integrate the storytelling with the gameplay, where so much of what you learn about like characters and the environment happens as you're examining things that you're looking at. It's not just, oh, it's a rusty 50-cent coin. It's like, oh, you get to learn what this is the 50-cent coin that was important to so-and-so back in the day, or, oh man, that looks really weird. I mean, I'm not quoting exact context because I'm going off the cuff, but you kind of get to see,
I get what you're saying.
You get to see what the characters think and what the setting's like just by poking around and stuff. And there's other things that it does too, but they're all more just like mild innovations. Certainly nothing that's really like jaw-dropping like some of the other elements that we've spotlit for Best Pixel. So yeah, I can more or less see where he's coming from still, nevertheless.
Well, and some of the thoughts you had brought up during our debates for Best Direction, I got to hear a little bit more of that, which we didn't discuss here, but it was kind of like a thousand cuts argument is what I sort of settled on. There were a lot of really small things that emulated like gameplay and story working collaboratively, and so that was really cool. It was definitely a worthwhile consideration, to be sure. It's there, I guess, just like, compared with like Doom and Myst, I'm like, I don't know. That's a pretty tall order. And so for me, I'm just sort of like, this is basically, for me, it just came across as mostly like your standard point and click fare. I mean, Loom was definitely more innovative for how well it trimmed back on its interface, and then Monkey Island used humor to have you like solve things, so that was a bit different. But this one here, I don't know. It just didn't strike me as particularly relevant the way that it was using like its gameplay mechanics. I think if you're familiar with point and click adventure games, you're gonna feel right at home here, and nothing is gonna really challenge or surprise you in that regard. And I think that's the larger point that I'm making.
Yeah, at least when it comes to the gameplay. The storyline does do some things that are pretty surprising, but in terms of gameplay, it's got a lot of mild innovations, but nothing that's really changing the game for the most part, I would say.
Well, and to be clear, this was, although it was in 5th place, but it was on my list for Best Pixel for 93. Like, I did support it on some level, because I felt like it was very unique what it decided to talk about, and, I mean, that alone just makes it noteworthy. It should be on our radar, because, they're a weird bunch, and there's definitely profound differences between them. You could argue that Mega Man X doesn't do enough with its story, or that Doom doesn't do enough with that, and that they're purely gameplay focused. And so this is kind of the alternative route, where you focus so much on the gameplay, or I put so much on the story rather, and not so much on the gameplay. And so, no game is perfect, but it's an interesting conversation point, to be sure.
If only we had a certain game that managed to synthesize storytelling and gameplay from say 1992, starting with an S. That would be really nice, wouldn't it?
You really want to go into that battleground?
Well, we'll save most of that for debate day, but yeah.
I mean, as for 93's situation, though, they have to settle that dispute on their own. It doesn't matter what 92 wins. 93 has to tough it out. And it's an interesting crop because you've got Illusion of Gaia came in. I mean, for full reference, this is the last episode we're recording, so we're kind of looking at it a little bit right now in retrospect. But, Illusion of Gaia could pull ahead because it's definitely unique and different and definitely deserving reappraisal, but then it's got some wonky translation issues, and so that kind of holds it back. And then it's also like gameplay innovations are like interesting, but not necessarily deep. It's also lacking a lot of gameplay categories as well. And then you've got Myst, which is an unusual beast to be sure, but I think everybody knows how you feel about Myst at this point.
No comment. We'll save that for debate day, I think.
Okay. Well, something I want to just slip in here really quick before we close things out. Since this is the last episode that we're recording, I just wanted to let everybody know, normally we have the ceremony take place in October, which is technically still the plan, but after we host that, it's a recording, and then I have to edit the video and then post it, and I have to post it on a Saturday in lieu of keeping with Oscarina Saturday. So my intention is still for it to release in October, but don't be surprised if it doesn't show up, because we're having some trouble getting everyone to coordinate for debate days and then to actually record the ceremony. There's just a lot going on in our personal lives, and so it may have to be delayed a little bit. If it does get delayed, it should show up in November, but don't expect it to be early November. Here in the US, we have an election cycle coming up, and that always it's always best to wait for the fallout to settle from that before trying to intervene. So yeah, I apologize if it's a little bit later this year than normal, but that's the reason. So at the very least, you can expect to see the awards in at the end of November, maybe around Thanksgiving time.
Sounds good. So, if you would like to play Gabriel Knight, I recommend that you purchase the original game on Steam for the incredibly low price of $6. There is a Gabriel Knight remake that exists, but it lacks the amazing voice talents from the original game release, and I am less fond of the art style personally. Also, when you do play, make sure that you start by reading the included comic book, and I also recommend using the official manual and hint book for when you get stuck.
They cut the voice talent in the remake?
Unfortunately, they lost the tapes that they had them, which is a tragic shame, honestly.
That's awful.
Yeah.
Ouch. So they got new voice actors? Is that what they did?
Yep, that they did. I doubt that there probably is. I mean, I haven't listened to it very much, but I feel like there's no way. It's
tough shoes to fill. The voice actors are great in this game, so yeah, play the original. That's what I say.
Mm-hmm. So to leave us with a final concluding sentence, if Gabriel Knight wins Best Pixel, it will showcase the mature storytelling potential for video games when the resources of a big-budget game developer are combined with the creative control of a talented writer and game designer.